Hi, I'm Michelle Shingler, Editor-in-Chief of Foreword Reviews, and you're tuning into Petit Foreword, our bite-sized interviews with indie authors. Today we're talking to Dr. Frances Young, whose latest book, Twilight of the Godlings, releases on June 15th. It's a nuanced, complex history of pagan deities and supernatural creatures in Britain. Dr. Young, thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you very much. It's great to speak to you.
So you posit that fairy lore is the diffuse and repurposed wreckage of pre-Christian religious beliefs, not their lineal successor. Still, if one wanted to examine the oldest surviving part of this ship of beliefs, where would they look?
I think one area where we can say that there's been a survival of belief from very ancient times in the British Isles is when we look at the association between supernatural beings, fairies in particular, but other beings too, and water. So something which seems to be a thread that runs through right from the Iron Age all the way through to the present day is that there's a particular kind of supernatural association with pools, springs, meres, rivers. And there's something there which I think we could point to as perhaps the oldest level of this kind of belief.
You also write that Godlings endured because it was too hard for new religions to reach the niches they occupied. Can you give us a sense of what those niches were?
Yeah, well, something that we find in the ancient world, but also in the early medieval world and going through into the early modern world too, is that Godlings seem to be associated with things like childbirth, with determining human destiny, human life events. They're associated with events very much dependent on chance and weather. They're associated with the fertility of crops, the health of cattle and things like that, and horses. And things as basic as whether bread rises or whether milk turns into butter and things like that. And these are things where official religion didn't really get into those crevices in people's lives and didn't really provide the answers that in a kind of subsistence economy in a pre-industrial society you need to survive. So one explanation for why these godlings do continue to exist is that people still need them in these areas of their life.
You also argue that godlings were reinvented after the Norman conquest out of something akin to nostalgia. Even factoring in the power of nostalgia, why weren't such reinventions viewed as a threat to British Christianity?
Yeah, so I mean, this reinvention that takes place after the Norman conquest seems to be a kind of recombination of what was perhaps surviving Anglo-Saxon beliefs about elves with other beliefs such as British beliefs, that is to say, beliefs held by people in Wales, Brittany, Cornwall, about supernatural beings living under the earth. And I think they're not really a threat to Christianity for the same reason, really, that we get the survival of godlings in these kind of niches of everyday life, in that official Christianity was not concerned with some of these domains that people claim to encounter the godlings. And I think because they're not objects of worship, there was no cult of fairies as such. And in the early Middle Ages, there was great uncertainty about the nature of the natural world, and philosophy in the way that we understand it hadn't yet developed within Western Christendom. And I think that uncertainty and that openness to different explanations for natural phenomena allows these things to persist. It's only in the later Middle Ages that it becomes associated with heresy and unacceptable belief.
So what, if anything, do you think modern representations of fairies have in common with their earliest antecedents, and how do they most obviously differ from those antecedents?
I think when you look at modern representations of fairies, there are still certain features that we can trace right the way through. And one of those is an association with life events and with the fate of human beings, which interestingly is expressed in modern fairy lore through the association between fairies and children. But that's not a kind of infantile association. It's the idea that children are kind of potential human beings with their entire lives ahead of them, and therefore their entire fate, their entire destiny is still in potentiality. And so I think that's the reason why fairies are associated with children. It goes way back. And of course, you've got the changeling myths as well. Another feature, I think, which you find with modern fairies is the association with nature. Now, that might take forms in modern fairy lore that is alien to what you find in the medieval and the early modern materials, such as flower fairies. Nothing like that exists in that earlier lore. But the basic idea that fairies are nature spirits, that they are in some sense tutelary spirits over nature, that's something that we do find as well. And I think the idea that fairies are kind of on the edge of the human and the non-human, I think that's a kind of a thread as well that continues.
So I know this is a little beyond the bounds of your book, what you even mentioned in the epilogue, but what do you make of the contemporary resurgence of fairy lore within some religious and spiritual spaces?
Well, I think modern fairies are very interesting in their own right. They have their own lore, they have their own folklore, they have their own history. I think that they can be traced to literature, the influence of Shakespeare on modern fairies and other authors, the influence of Victorian novels, Victorian drama is very great. I think that the most obvious point of departure between modern fairies and traditional fairies, which is often remarked upon, is that modern fairies have wings. And of course, traditional fairies don't. And I think also the tiny, tiny stature of modern fairies, that they are these kind of minuscule beings about the size of a flower or a petal or something like that. That's obviously not found in the traditional fairy lore, where fairies are diminutive. They're about the size of a 3-year-old child usually, or they're fully adult size. They can be life size. So I think these are departures. And I think there's also a strong influence from 19th century spiritual movements like Theosophy, spiritualism, the influence of cultural moments like the Cottingley Fairies hoax as well is huge when it comes to modern fairies. But I think that one thing which is being recovered in modern interest in fairies is the idea that fairies are scary, the idea that fairies are bad as well as good. And I think when you look at the mid-20th century, fairies had become a bit anodyne, the Disney fairy. But when you look at today, there's more kind of interest in moral ambiguity. And I think that fairies embody that moral ambiguity. And I think also as concern about the environment and the climate grows, people see fairies as nature spirits, but those nature spirits are not necessarily going to be all that happy with the way that we are treating nature and the way that we are allowing the planet to be destroyed. So I think that might be another reason why fairies are starting to take on an edge in popular culture.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Your book was fascinating. I so enjoyed spending time with it. I learned so much. To our audience, it comes out on June 15th. Please go pick up a copy. And Dr. Young, thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you very much.